Hey, I'm Felissa Rose, and you're watching Keto and Crime.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Thought Crime and Keto and Crime. Today we've got part one of a very unusual case. Today we're going to get into ISSEI Sagawa, also known as Pang, and that name will become even more ironic as we go on, but he is currently a 70-year-old Japanese man that was convicted in 1981 of killing and cannibalizing a Dutch woman in Paris, France. So, before we get grossed out, I have to tell you, if you have a weak stomach, weak constitution, I would highly recommend not viewing the next two videos because I have part one now, part two with my good friend comedian Michelle Muldoon. We will discuss this case together. So if you have a weak stomach and can't stand off-color jokes, then I highly recommend you pass up for the next one. But let's get into it, shall we? ISSEI Sagawa was born April 26, 1949 in, ironically, Kobe, Japan. Yes, the same region where the beef famously comes from cows that are massaged and fed milk, just known for it to be very succulent meat. So yes, he is from that region. He was born into a very well-off family that treated both he and his brother very, very well. Some irregularities noted, though, from his past, we're going to call him Pang, noted from Pang's past, was that in school he had a hard time communing with other students. His teacher says that he would kind of keep to himself, didn't really want to get into group play, and especially seemed to be scared of the opposite sex. So he was kind of scared of girls. Later on in a psychological evaluation, Pang would admit that one time during a physical education class, one of his classmates, another male, happened to pull up his shorts a little bit on his leg, and he saw the perfectly formed male thigh, or at that time, for a young prepubescent boy, what must have seemed as a perfectly formed thigh. And that was the point, he said, that he started thinking of ingesting humans, turning to cannibalism. Also, along this time, he was going through puberty. He said he found it very hard to self-pleasure, like most, healthy people during puberty. We masturbate, right? He found that very, very hard. He said that he could not, for the life of him, make it happen. And I'll just leave you to draw your own conclusions to that. He did say that the only time that he felt any sort of arousal was when a certain uncle of his would come over and play a game with he and his brother where he pretended to be a creature of some sort, chase him around and say, "I'm going to gobble you up." He would feel arousal then. He also felt arousal when he saw the thigh of his classmate, but instead of it being more of a sexual arousal, it wasn't that he wanted to have sex with them so much, he said. It was that he dreamed of eating them. All right. So he grew up into a teenager. He also admitted that to help himself do what he needed to do when it came to puberty, that he also would put things like sauces and things like that on his private region and have his dog lick it off. He said so he said he engaged in a form of bestiality as a child during this time. Anything to get that sexual finish, but he said he couldn't. But later on, as a teenager, he started to get fascinated with Western women that were not from the Far East, European, American, Canadian women. He saw them because they were highly, highly popularized in the magazines, movies, television shows in Japan.
人の女性に憧れたかというのはよくわかりません。ただ僕は体が弱くて小さかったので 白人の女性は背が高く美しく、そういうものに対する憧憬、憧れというのが非常に強かったと思います。
As being the ultimate, the ultimate pinnacle of beauty. I think that's kind of telling. I think most cultures, if it's something that you're not exposed to every day, then anything that's exotic for your area becomes the pinnacle of beauty. I know many Western men that have the same, no, though not the same sick fascination, but the same sort of affinity for Eastern and Asian women, because they don't see them a whole lot. So I think that's just something that happens. In fact, having a young Japanese man in the 60s and 70s having these feelings toward Western women was not necessarily unusual. But he did start to equate that with that sexual arousal, that sexual feeling he felt toward them with consuming their flesh. Another thing to remember about Pang is that he was a very small man, a very small boy. When he was born, his father recollected that he could fit into the palm of his hand. That's how small he was. He also suffered with enteritis, which is a disease of the small intestine. He did get over that, but it kind of made it impossible for him to have the normal dietary habits of a young child. He was pretty much on a very lean protein, vegetable, rice-based diet as a child, mostly rice and easy to digest grains were pretty much what he had to eat as a child. So I can imagine limiting his consumption of meat, limiting his consumption of other things besides easily digestible foods. I can imagine that also gave him some sort of gastronomical fixation on certain things, and that may have fed into his turn toward cannibalism. However, he was never large in stature. Fully grown, at the age of 18, he was only 4'9". But he was an incredibly intelligent boy. He did well in school. He went to college. He wanted to pursue advanced degree in literature. And he was actually studying at a university in Tokyo when at the age of 24, he became obsessed with a German girl that was also living in Tokyo, attending the university there. And he started to basically stalk her. That all culminated in a certain evening where he decided he wanted to follow her home, sneak into her home, wait till she was sleeping, and then basically slice essentially a pound of flesh from her rump, for lack of, to make it a little more easy to hear, and wanted to consume it.
ただ、たまたま東京に住んでる時に、近くを金髪赤眼のすごく綺麗な女性が通っていて、その白いふくらはぎに目がくらんで、しかも不思議なことにそれはかつて祖母が住んでいたアパートに住んでいると思い込んだんです。彼女の1階の部屋に忍び込みました。彼女は、裸で横になって眠っていたんです。ただ折りたたみ傘で少し頭を叩いて気絶して、ですごく幼稚な考え方ですけど、台所にあるであろうナイフでお尻の肉をちょっと。
And one Friday night, he did exactly that. He followed her home from a party she had been at. He went into her home. He waited until she was asleep and then attempted to slice his serving of flesh from her backside. However, she woke up, and being a very tall, stocky woman, she was able to put him down in short order. The police were called. He was arrested. His father, who was very wealthy, was able to get him off with pretty much no punishment whatsoever by paying the German woman off and asking her to drop the charges, which did happen. As you can imagine, he didn't really have a plan for this. I mean, you would think that if you were going to sneak in and try to take actual flesh from somebody, you might want to, I don't know, have some chloroform or something like that to prevent them from waking up, or at least have a gun or something, a knife to hold them at bay while you did it. He had nothing. He just went in there with the anticipation of quickly slicing the flesh that he wanted and getting gone before she even really knew what happened. Didn't really work. So in 1977, at the age of 27, Sagawa, or Pang, moved to Paris, France to study at the Sorbonne University in Paris, and was just kind of taken aback by the abundance of the Western women, the Western culture, and most importantly, the famous Parisian food that was available in Paris at that time. He started going out, he said, to find restaurants, spending his father's money. He also wanted to kind of indulge his sexual appetites, and he started bringing home prostitutes, Parisian prostitutes, every night, hoping that would kind of, satisfy whatever urges he had. However, that did not work. He had trouble performing, by his own account, and his fantasies for these prostitutes turned from sex to wanting to cannibalize them pretty quickly, so he stopped doing that. He kind of became a recluse. He had a hard time assimilating to his fellow students, his fellow Ph.D. students, as he was trying to pursue an advanced degree in literature, because he was very, very good at reading, translating, writing. And most of the students, it was a very small knit class, so most of his students forged relationships and friends, but he didn't. He had a hard time with that. And eventually he met the woman that would be his victim. He met Renee Hartevelt, a Dutch student in his class, from pretty much the beginning. She was, according to him, to recent interviews and writings of his, she was the only Western woman that had ever really given him the time of day. She was nice to him. She would talk with him. She invited them out to class nights to try to get him out of the house, to get him acclimated to his fellow students. And he developed a very, very sinister attachment to her. She was, like a lot of Aryan women, she was tall. She pretty much resembled the German woman that he had tried to attack in Tokyo. So he was immediately attracted to her, and she was nice. By this time, Sagawa was 32 years old, while his intended victim was 25. He admitted that he had fallen head over heels for her in love, but instead of having normal attachments like anyone else that would, want to be with somebody, just asking them out, getting to know them, he felt that the ultimate way he could show his love for her was to kill her and consume her. And that became his MO. For the longest time, they were friends. And finally, in mid-1981, he devised a plan to get her alone in his apartment and kind of carry out his macabre fantasy. June 11th, 1981, he invited Renee over to his apartment at 10 Rue Erlanger in Paris, under the precept of helping him translate a German poem. Now, as I said, they were pursuing a advanced degree in Western literature, so most everyone in that class was multilingual. Sagawa himself spoke Japanese, English, French, and some various other Asian languages, whereas Renee spoke Dutch, German, French, English, and, of course, German. Hence why he chose a German poem. He was careful to choose a language that he was not fluent in so that he would have a reason to get her there. And ironically, it was a German poem about love and consuming another, so it had overtones of cannibalism. So he invited her over under the precept that for a extra credit class he was taking, that he needed to have someone read the poem aloud in very good German for a audio cassette recorder. So she got there in the evening. He said they exchanged a few pleasantries, and she sat down at the desk where he had set up a tape recorder and a microphone and had a book of German poems open. She, of course, had to turn her back to him because early on he had expressed that he did not think he could look her in the eye, and certainly not look her in the eye and take her life, because he had gone out and actually purchased a shotgun several days earlier before this. And so I think the fact he could not look her in the eye kind of fed back into his insecurities and his, kind of vulnerability around women. So basically he had planned for her not to be facing him. So she was sitting there. started to read the poem into the microphone he had set up. He stood behind her as if he was observing, and then he kind of took the shotgun in from behind the little mini fridge he had in his apartment, and he shot her once in the back of the neck, killing her instantly. Immediately, he said that he wanted to attempt to dine on her rear appendage, so he immediately cut her out of her clothing and began cutting into her buttocks to get to the meat. He said he was very disappointed that instead of getting right to muscle and meat like you do in most animal carcasses, it was mainly fat and tissue for the first few inches. So he said he did try it. He said it had the consistency of cream corn, but he did not, or the consistency of roasted corn. He did not say he enjoyed it very much, and it took him way too long, he said, to get to the muscle, which leads me to believe if he was this interested, why didn't he at least get some sort of anatomy book to understand how the human body works? But I don't know. But he's crazy. So anyway, he started to consume there. He said he flipped her over. He did have post-mortem sexual relations with her. After he finished, he said he kissed her on the mouth and said he loved her, and then finished basically removing the chunks of flesh he wanted to keep, taking most of her buttocks, most of her breasts, and some other flesh from other areas of the body. He wrapped it very carefully in butcher's paper and put it into the little mini fridge in his apartment. He then wrapped her up in plastic and stuffed the remains of her body into 2 large suitcases. He immediately left his apartment with the 2 suitcases, intending to go to a nearby park, a lake known as Bois de Bouillon, and basically dump the suitcases in and be done with her. However, remember, he's a slight man, so he was having trouble, even with the rollers on the suitcases, getting to where he needs to be. He ended up stopping and summoning a cab. Later on, that cab driver would say that he thought he was acting pretty weird, and he thought it was strange that he had this luggage and didn't want to go to a train station or the airport or anything. But anyway, he took him to this park. Sagawa got out, rolled down to the lake, but he was so tired he had to sit down and rest for a moment. And a passerby happened to pass him by, stopped to strike up a conversation. He said in the midst of the conversation, Sagawa simply got up, bid him good night, and left, leaving his luggage there. The guy called out to him. Sagawa would not return, so of course, this guy, curiosity like we all do, decides to open the suitcases and found Renee's remains. Immediately summoned the Paris police. He was pretty easy to find. Not the smartest criminal in the world. And French police actually arrested him at his apartment on June 12th, the next day. He pretty much confessed the moment they arrived at his door. They found her remains in his refrigerator and case closed. However, it wasn't. He was actually put into a Parisian asylum to undergo psychological evaluations, where he sat for quite a bit of time, 2 years. And eventually it was determined by French psychologists that he was unfit to stand trial. He was legally insane and therefore couldn't be tried under French law. French judge Jean-Louis Bourgour did, and I'm sure I'm butchering these French names, I'm so sorry. I only know French toast and French fries, so. But he was basically, thanks to interference again from his wealthy father, who hired a pretty mad dog French attorney, he was basically freed from the asylum and deported back to Japan under the pretense that the Tokyo police would immediately take him into custody and prosecute him in Japan. He was taken into custody upon arriving back home in Japan and put back into a mental institution. However, due to his father hiring the best attorneys and doing everything he could to get his son out of jail, he was eventually ruled to be unfit to stand trial, and because of a Tokyo loophole, a Japanese loophole at the time that said that insane people could not be held, he was able to pretty much sign himself out of the asylum, and he walked free in 1983 into the streets of Tokyo. And since then, sadly, he became kind of a Japanese celebrity. He wrote 20 different books on poetry. One a suspense thriller called In the Fog, where he pretty much describes his crime. He also was cast in several Japanese horror movies, all the time in creepy voyeur type roles, and it's pretty much also been, besides the royalties from his books and the money he's gotten from being in movies, he's pretty much lived on, government aid and his parents. His parents passed away in 2005. He's currently the age of 70, living under assumed name in a Tokyo apartment alone, with his brother checking in on him occasionally. And each day he performs, he says, a Shinto religious ceremony for his parents. And he says that he still has the urge to eat people. But he doesn't. He says he no longer has an attraction to Western women. Instead, is back onto Japanese women. I'm sure that does not comfort the women of Japan. But anyway, that's where we are. He's still around, like I said, living under assumed name, and has profited off of his crimes, definitely. But that's where we'll end. That's where the saga of Issei Sagawa ends. I think it's a slap in the face to the family of the girl he killed, but he has publicly apologized to them. But I'm like, hey, yeah, whatever, dude, you're still sick. He needs to not be walking free, but I'm not Japanese authorities. But anyway, that's where we'll end. I'll be back next time with Michelle Muldoon and I discussing this case more in depth. I hope you enjoyed our overview of it. Like, comment, share, subscribe. If you want to support the channel, links are down below. Thanks a lot, guys. Keto Comic.